So this is a bit of an experiment in taking a picaresque story of a Syrian exile turned Tuscan diplomat turned spy, and reading it in a structural way, reading the broader conflict or the broader Syrian Civil War of 1606 and 1607 in a structural way. So I've outlined here sort of where I propose to take us and the story as it is, so that as we have a welter of names and dates and places that may be unfamiliar, that we have some sense of the overall narrative arc. So I'll do a little preview of who the people are and what the major events are, and then we'll move into the phases of the conflict. We'll start with the Ottoman Safavid War, which is the occasion of the Syrian Civil War. The Syrian Civil War takes place in the midst of two Ottoman international wars, one with the Safavid Empire in Iran, and one with the Austrian Habsburgs in the Balkans. Then we'll take a little pause to do my first sort of structural intervention and look at some patterns of imperial history over the really long durée in Syria and Iran and Turkey. That'll be a brief skip through a whole variety of empires to look at why it is that it's sort of entirely unsurprising that the Ottomans and the Safavids should be fighting in this place. And then we'll follow the story again and return to the sort of core narrative of the rebellion. We'll look briefly at the Ottoman military defeat, the Syrian rebellion, and then spend some time on the Grand Duchy of Tuscany's efforts to mobilize its alliance to destroy Ottoman tyranny, liberate the oppressed Syrians, hand out weapons, and create a new independent kingdom of Syria. And then we'll look at the failure of all of these dreams and ambitions, as the Ottoman Empire turns out not to be a trivial force to reckon with. All right. So there's where we're going, and let's get started here. All right, so lots of names and dates and people. Let me just highlight a few. Shah Abbas is the most dynamic leader of the Safavid Empire, perhaps the most dynamic leader of Iran in the last 500 years. He transforms and really rescues the Safavid Empire. Sultan Ahmed is really a child at the beginning of this, and so it's in a sort of weak position, and so instead it's the Grand Viziers. You'll notice that there's a tempo of execution. It's hazardous to be a rebel. It's also hazardous to be a Grand Vizier. All right. So people who wield supreme power, but who can also fall. A couple of unfamiliar words. There is a set of rebellions taking place in Anatolia called the Chalali rebellions from the 1590s to the early 1610, 1611, really. The Chalalis are these armed bands. They can be bandits, and they can also be sort of auxiliary, irregular troops who sometimes have a role to play, as in major wars, but who also try to carve out their own local power bases. At this point, they sort of agglomerate and carve out larger blocks of territory, really principalities, in Anatolia. And they're a huge problem for the Ottoman Empire, sort of internal crumbling of the empire. And then, in terms of our Western actors here, the leader is Ferdinando de' Medici, is Grand Duke of Tuscany, and this is his ambassador, who's also a Syrian exile. He's from Aleppo originally.
But when we say Tripoli, do we mean Lebanon?
Yeah, in Lebanon. Yeah, so this is Tripoli in Lebanon. It's a good question. There is a separate intervention in Libya and Tunisia, which I talked about earlier this month. I'm happy to tell you about that. And then, in terms of the overall arc, we're not going to go through this in detail, but you'll see little sections of this chart, and we can come back to this if you have questions. But I've tried to sort of outline the overall progression of events. We have lots of battles and names and dates. The core part is that there's a long Turkish war in the Balkans, this 13-year war between the Austrian Habsburgs and the Ottomans, which is basically a stalemate. There's an Ottoman Safavid war. Very unusually, the Ottomans lose this war. The Ottomans usually win Ottoman Safavid wars. And then the Kumbulad are the Kurdish rebel dynasty that we're working with. Okay. Setting the scene, why it is that the Ottoman Empire is in Syria in the first place. This actually has to do with the entwined early histories of the Ottomans and the Safavids. The Safavid Empire in the early 16th century engages in extraordinarily rapid expansion and has huge support in Ottoman Anatolia, in Asia Minor, in Turkey. And the Safavids are defeated at the Battle of Shadran in 1514. This is the most important defeat the Safavid Empire ever suffers. and really stop Safavid expansion in its tracks. This opens the space for the Ottomans to conquer the Mamluk Empire. This means that by 1517, the Ottoman Empire controls not just large sections of the Balkans and Turkey, but also the entire Levantine shore and Egypt. So it becomes much larger. The Ottomans and Safavids have an ideological rivalry. The Safavids define themselves as Shia, the Ottomans as Orthodox Sunni, and then after the conquest of the Mamluk Empire as the protectors of the holy places and as caliphs. Right? So there's an ideological dimension to this conflict, and there's also a traditional dimension to the conflict, which recurs. These are not all of the Ottoman Safavid wars, but some of the more important ones. So it is a history of conflict. Okay. This particular Ottoman Safavid war takes place in the reign of Shah Abbas, who's originally comes to power amidst defeat, engages in a series of disruptive internal reforms in Iran in the 1590s, and then takes advantage of Ottoman weakness to recapture key Iranian territory, not least of which is Tabriz, here, in 1603. It is in the context of this war the rebellion in Syria breaks out. So, yeah.
What do you mean when you say Syria? Am I to think of it as Syria as it exists today, or am I thinking just Aleppo?
You should be thinking larger. Al-Sham is what it is. This is the historic region of Syria, which includes Aleppo, Damascus, but also all of Lebanon, parts of Jordan and Israel. It's sort of the space between Anatolia and Egypt. And that's their self-definition of it's often written Soria, S-O-R-I-A, when it's transliterated.
The Ottoman definition.
This is, in fact, a very ancient definition of Syria. So this goes back. You see this in, say, the Cairo Geniza documents. It's been in like the 11th century. Okay, Jessica Goldberg has shown this on the medieval side. So it's a sort of historic Syria, like we can say historic Italy, even though there's no country of Italy. Make sense so far? Okay. The Ottomans do poorly because they're overstretched. Because when they're not overstretched, they always win, more or less, in summary. Okay, so then I want to do my first sort of structural patterns of history element here. Why is it that the Ottomans and the Safavids are fighting over this particular region? Right? And in particular, why is it that this is a set of imperial conflicts instead of a series of small states in the region? Right? What I'd like to suggest, at least visually, is that there's almost always a large empire based in Iran and a rivalry with empires based either in Anatolia or in Egypt. This is extraordinarily antique as a pattern. Right? So this is a kind in Persia, which is famously destroyed by Alexander the Great, whose successor Seleucus bases his empire in Syria, right, and then eventually loses the Iranian section. The Romans pick up the western side and famously have a long series of rivalries with first the Parthians and then the Sassanid Empire, fighting notably over this region, as they do entire Roman and Byzantine history as well, right? So the region we're talking about is here. It is frequently contested. You'll see that that border moves back and forth. Even in the sort of core periods of Islamic expansion, right? The power starts in Damascus and then shifts to Baghdad, and then real power shifts to the Buyids based in Iran. Right? We move, we're covering 1,600 years, I know, but you're getting the flavor of large empires based in Iran, extending first into Iraq, and then towards the Mediterranean. You can see this with the Kharazians, or the Ilkhanate, and this, I suppose, gets us to the more specific period that we're interested in, which is the rise of the Safavid Empire and its rivalry with the Ottomans. The Safavids rise out of the dissolution of the Timurid Empire, right? And the Timurid Empire breaks up into the Black and White Sheep confederations, which are then succeeded by the Safavids. Okay, so that's a huge amount of history. It's 2,000 years of history. But the visual pattern, I hope, is striking enough, right? There's an empire based here, right, which has expansionist interests this way, and which often confronts political units here or here and fights over this region, which is also what's happening in the Ottoman Safavid Wars, all four of them, more or less. So, first sort of vision of structural analysis. And then this is Shah Abbas and his new capital of Isfahan. Okay. We can revisit these things, but I thought I would give you at least some of the visuals for where we are. The period that we're engaged in is an imperial period. So the sort of notion of breaking up the Ottoman Empire into its constituent pieces is sort of a radical break. Most of Eurasia is dominated by large and at this time expanding empires. Right? Ming China, Russia's in the process of expansion, so is the Rebels. So that's sort of our sort of broader structural story. But let me bring this back in to the specific context of the Ottoman Empire, which is engaged in expansion on all fronts. The classic Ottoman Empire is in decay. At least this is the traditional story we associate with somebody like Halil Analchik, right? That the original period of the sort of payoff of rapid expansion that takes place in the 16th century really slows down. That conflict in the Balkans starts to be more costly and less profitable. That expansion against the Safavids is more difficult with Safavid reform, and that there's increasing difficulties in holding on to the edges of the Ottoman Empire. And our story in the 17th and 18th centuries on the Ottoman side is sort of devolution of power to local authorities within the framework of the empire. So the rebels here who are looking for independence are in many ways looking for something that is akin to what happens within the empire itself. And that's sort of our long-term story. Does that make sense? Okay, so now let's take it, and then this is just a contemporary map of the Ottoman Empire. And this is Syria. Okay, so back to the specific conflict and the Syrian Civil War that I wanted to address here. The Ottomans suffer a major battlefield defeat at the Battle of Sufyan outside of Tabriz in November of 1605. Their commander, called the Serdar, is particularly enraged that one of his clients, who is this Kurdish emir, he's the emir of Kilish, and sometime Pasha of Aleppo, does not show up for the battle. He shows up a day late to the battle. The retreating Ottoman army encounters these forces, and the Serdar orders the execution of the head of the Kambalad clan. So this is he orders the head of the clan's head, more or less. And then the Serdar himself dies shortly thereafter. So there's a sort of vacuum of authority on both the Ottoman side and on the Kambalad side, whose position has now been delegitimated. This leads to our cry for rebellion on the basis of revenge, and on the basis that this is an autocratic act by a now deceased and defeated commander. So there's some vacillation among the rebels as to whether they're fighting to have autonomy or status within the Ottoman Empire or whether they're looking for independence. They eventually go for independence, but part of the slowness of the Ottoman reaction is a little bit of uncertainty. These are people within the Ottoman hierarchy. Okay. So, Kambadulu Ali Pasha, who we usually know as just Ali Pasha, raises the standard of rebellion and seizes Aleppo. And he works with Lebanese Druze rebels, under an emir named Fakhardin. And they defeat the existing Ottoman forces, first at the Battle of Hama, and then take Tripoli in Lebanon. They capture all of Lebanon and extort tribute from Damascus. And so they have a sort of suzerainty over Damascus and also a domination over neighboring rebel regimes in a region we know as Cilicia. And also there is a rebel regime in Baghdad. So Ottoman authority in Syria, Iraq, and southeastern Turkey is sort of crumbling in 1606. Yeah.
You keep mentioning that Ali Pasha is Kurdish. Is there a Kurdish Ottoman element to this story?
Yes. So there is. He's part of the sort of authority in Syria and southeastern Turkey. Works in sort of two different ways. There's an Ottoman hierarchy, Beylerbeys who are based in, and a whole sort of military and administrative hierarchy based in major political centers like Tripoli, Damascus, and Aleppo. And then there are hereditary emirs with their own personal forces. The Kambalad clan are the emirs of Kilish. They have their own forces. And that hereditary hierarchy is associated with their position in that region. So they sort of identify as Kurdish in contradistinction to both the Ottoman perception of themselves and the perception of people in Aleppo and Damascus as being Arab. Right, so there's a sort of ethnic distinction that's at least perceived at the time. And that's how the historiography treats it. Beyond that, I can't go. But hopefully that sort of answers the question there. And the Fakhreddin, who's the Lebanese emir who leads this, is a sort of hero in certain Lebanese nationalist circles for creating the notion of modern Lebanon. He too ends up executed, but rebellion is a really dangerous thing. Okay, so this is the sort of high watermark of the rebellion militarily, right? They've captured Aleppo, which is the largest and most important city in the region, right? They have dominated Damascus and Tripoli, Lebanon. They have a network of allies in Anatolia and among rebels in Iraq, and they have a positive, perhaps, alliance relationship with Shah Abbas. At least they share foreign allies. The Tuscans are allies of both Shah Abbas and of these rebel communities in Syria. All right, so the decision is then taken to move to outright independence. I've included a little quote from Machiavelli on the dangers of a new regime and its weakness. The sort of symbolic gestures to declare independence are they have their name read in Friday prayers, an issue of new coinage, and they sign a treaty with a foreign prince. So this is the sort of, all three of which are basically not allowed if you are loyal members of the Ottoman hierarchy. At least so is the... So now we move to sort of my specialty, what the Grand Duchy of Tuscany is doing in this. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany dispatches an ambassador, actually a team of ambassadors, but it's led by an individual we know as Michelangelo Karai. This is a sort of Italianization of his name. He's originally from Aleppo and is in exile to do with personal conflicts with the Ottoman authorities in the 1580s. He goes into exile first into Iran and then to Italy, and he's involved as a translator in a series of missions before. So he has his own agenda. But the draft letter that Karai will be translating and bringing in person to Aleppo uses the language of tyranny to say, this is a language that the Tuscans use about the Ottomans in all of their correspondence. So they do this in their correspondence with Syria, and the Tuscans do this in their correspondence with Iran. This is overthrowing the great tyranny of the Ottoman house and setting up instead the independent lord protectors of Syria, the house of, well, they know them as Can Bulat, the Can Bulat house. So, perhaps this is the necessary corollary of this. In an era of empire, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany and its allies are not seeking territory. This is sort of unusual in that previous European interventions in the region had often sought territory, especially in the Holy Land. And instead they disavow any territorial interest. Instead it's about liberation. So the Tuscan vision is that Ottoman tyranny will be thrown off, that the oppressed peoples, or in particular the oppressed emirs in the region, will have independence and will guarantee certain rights to foreigners in the region, but will otherwise, Tuscany will be satisfied by the removal of this imperial threat. That's Tuscany's payoff. So, yeah.
Did the papal state had any view on this, or was Tuscans alone in this endeavor?
So that's an excellent point. Let's see if we can get to. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany casts itself as being, and it's just sort of the tail wagging the dog here, as the spokesperson and leader of the great Catholic alliance. Really, it's the alliance that won the Battle of Lepanto minus Venice, which is an important minus. And the Grand Duchy of Tuscany's role is to provide the first wave of support before the Spanish fleet, and then lesser papal and other Italian forces will arrive and provide the real muscle. So they are the leading edge of Western intervention, and then if there's any success, then real military forces associated with Spain. And Spain has the largest and most powerful empire in Europe at this time, and it's probably the only European power with both the navy and army to actually make a difference against the Ottomans, right, at this stage. Spain has its own problems and is not interested. We can get into that at this point in time, at a little bit of a later point in time, but the Grand Duke is ever hopeful that this is just around the corner. All right, so we're throwing off tyranny, liberating, and forming an alliance based on friendship and equality. Okay, that's our sort of alliance framework here. This is what the treaty that's eventually signed between the Grand Duchy of Tuscany and the Pasha of Aleppo, Ali Pasha, articulates. Okay. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany is a sort of unusual power to be involved here. The core point that I'd like to make is that at this moment in Florentine and Tuscan history, and really only this sort of 50-year moment, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany has a navy, at least from a fortified harbor at Livorno, which eventually becomes a free trade zone and a sort of famous site of tolerance and liberty in Italy, but at this point is basically a nest of pirates. These are state-supported pirates, called the Order of Santo Stefano, and the Tuscan Navy. And so Tuscany and this Order of Santo Stefano have an expeditionary capacity. So like they launch raids on, say, towns in Algeria and carry off slaves and fight naval battles. Right? So this is an unusual thing the Grand Duchy of Tuscany can do. They run out of money and have to sell off their navy 20 years later. But at this point in time, we're an ambitious and bumptious state. Okay. Oh, and then one last thing on this one. Tuscany deals regularly in slaves and captures slaves, etc. So it is run by an autocratic prince who has subverted a republic and is a sort of model for absolutism. So its rhetoric of liberty is very hollow. Right, that's a part to bear in mind.
Was this statue ever a problem?
This is a statue a problem for this? Yeah, there's a rhetorical issue. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany has a terrible habit of lying. It will go to...
No, also like today, do you know?
If it's a problem now?
Yeah.
Interestingly, not. That, I suppose, has to do with the different politics of Italy. Right? It's viewed as a sort of great work of art. It's also the case that like thousands of Italians are taken off into slavery in North Africa, and so it's felt as a sort of reciprocal thing. We can address that as a... I think mostly Livorno is a minor port, and people don't think about it that much. Okay, so here's the deal that Tuscany signs, right? Tuscany is going to provide advanced weapons. They have some of the best artillery in the world, and they're going to provide it for free. They're going to provide prestige goods, basically everything from like a great barrel of cheese to some marble columns and some lions to make a big fountain, right? A whole sort of things to set up, and like fancy clothes and things to set up a court, right? So that it's not sort of frivolous. The idea is that we're going to make this rebel emir, right? He's Neschloss's father and is trying to proclaim himself as the legitimate ruler of a territory that hasn't been an independent country in anybody's memory, right? As a legitimate prince. So we're going to set him up as a new prince. Tuscany will provide money, which they desperately need, and which the Grand Duchy of Tuscany has. They have some of the leading bankers in Europe, and they'll send the fleet. And Tuscany, in fact, does dispatch its fleet. Karai sends a semi-enciphered note from Cyprus saying, oh, well, the Greek rebels in Cyprus will rise in our support, so Tuscany sends 17 ships and 2,200 men to try to take Cyprus by surprise with the Greek rebels who aren't really there. So this doesn't work, but well, so there's this sort of high watermark of aspiration in the summer of 1607. Tuscany's going to provide all of these things, and the Pasha of Aleppo is supposed to give the Grand Duchy of Tuscany really extensive commercial privileges. You might think of these as the sort of capitulations that are eventually signed by the Ottoman Empire. A premier diplomatic position where sort of everybody else has to go through Tuscany. The Tuscan diplomat will be the key figure, the sort of most privileged figure in Syria, and the Holy Land, and a series of religious privileges for Catholic pilgrims in the Holy Land. So Tuscany, yeah.
What's the timeline here? I mean, I assume it's taking months for all this correspondence back and forth, and what are the Ottomans doing with this stuff?
So we'll get to that in just a sec there. So the sort of key timeline is 1605, November 1605, the Ottomans lose the Battle of Sufyan. By early autumn of 1606, the Ottomans have basically lost administrative control of Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Right. So this is because their own forces are defecting. Right. Because the Kambulad forces. Remember that the Kambulad emir had been executed for not bringing his army on time, which means that his army is intact and the Grand Vizier's army has just suffered a major defeat. Right. And there's defections of other subordinate Ottoman troops in Syria. So this is why it crumbles so quickly. Tuscany dispatches its embassy in 1607 and launches its naval raid in the summer of 1607. And the Ottomans are going to take immediate action, but not quite yet. Okay, so we won't get into too much detail. There's a lot of text, right? But this is the actual list of the things that are supposed to be sent. So we're going to send a battery of artillery, and we're going to send some guns and some white marble so that we can make this lovely fountain, and some gilded pistols and some arquebuses. Right, so we're going to look great. We will also send money and troops and ships and things later on, but this is the sort of initial down payment, right? That we're going to look like a real prince, because we have a major problem of legitimacy and authority. That's at least Tuscany's view of the matter. Okay. There's also an element of fantasy in this, and this is, I suppose, another structural element that I want to bring in, which is that Tuscany hopes, and in fact reports to its ambassador, that the great Catholic fleet is massing in Sicily. Now, the Catholic fleet masses in Sicily regularly as a means of securing the Western Mediterranean, but Tuscany hopes that the fleet will in fact set out to the Eastern Mediterranean, which it has the power to do and has done in times past. So the ambassador is sort of negotiating in good faith. The reports he's getting in April of 1607 from Tuscany is that the Great Fleet is coming, right? That help is on its way. And that we really are going to break up Ottoman power in this region, right? We'll work with the Safavids, and we'll have a new vision of sort of greater historic Syria, right? And that the Ottomans will be much weaker as a result. Okay, then I want to wrap up and have some time to talk, so I'll be quick about this here. The core problem, as I think you're addressing here, is that Karai, the ambassador Karai here, is the only person with the language skills and cultural knowledge to actually do this deal, right? He has already worked for Shah Abbas in Iran and a translating capacity on one of Abbas's embassies. He is in exile from Aleppo, so he cannot return home if the existing Ottoman regime is present. Right? So he is theoretically just the agent of the absolute prince in Tuscany, who just does the prince's will. But he is in fact the only one with the language skills and knowledge to make this happen. So he is in exile with control of language and information. And the way that he casts this story is a war of liberation. This is another structural issue we might imagine, which is the role of exiles with privileged but biased information. His story is he's eventually captured and tortured by Ottoman forces when they take Aleppo, and manages to get out and heads off to continue as his embassy to Shah Abbas. So then here's the question about what the Ottomans are doing. So the first thing they do is they get out of the war with the Austrian Habsburgs. They do this in November of 1606. Right? This means that they're no longer fighting on two fronts. It also means that their best army, which is in Rumelia, in the Balkans, is able to be transferred over, and they have a secure frontier there. Under the banner of continuing the war with Shah Abbas, with continuing the war against the Safavids, wily Grand Vizier, Murad Pasha, leads his army into Anatolia and then changes plans. Or in fact, he already has this plan, but he announces to his army that what we're really going to do is deal with all of these rebels. We're going to deal with the Jalali rebels, and we're going to deal with, in particular, this Kambulad rebellion in Syria. It's not okay that we have foreign intervention here. This is a tricky move because there are also rebels in Western Anatolia, and we sort of bypassed Murat Pasha leads, this is a major Ottoman field army. Estimates are sort of iffy for numbers, but I think 70,000 troops or so. Right, so a major field army. And he moves and he takes Adana in Cilicia very quickly. The collapse of this position, which is in sort of southeastern Turkey, the Kurdish region of Turkey now, opens up invasion to Syria. So there's a mountain range that otherwise protects the position on Aleppo. Once this falls, the rebels are in very serious trouble. Nasu Pasha, who had had a negative relationship with the Kambulads before in Syria, who eventually becomes Grand Vizier, knocks out the separate rebellion in Iraq, which is sort of a separate story from this, in 1607. So now the eastern flank is also in trouble. And Tuscan strike on Cyprus fails, which means that the Tuscan fleet is not coming with all of its artillery. There is then a major battle at Arushabasi. This is sort of right now in Syria, sort of between two parts of the Turkish border, so it's right on that border there. It's a multi-day battle, which is surprising. But at the end, the Kambulad forces, usually estimated at 35,000, are destroyed, and the Ottomans recapture Aleppo in Syria. You would think, therefore, that Ali Pasha would die in 1607, but he doesn't. In fact, he is appointed to a new position in the Ottoman administration in the Balkans, but not trusted there, and eventually executed. He has a sort of long, winding path. But this notion that he's not immediately killed is also part of the way that rebellion works in the Ottoman Empire. That you can, in fact, defy local authorities and still wend your way back into positions of trust and influence. It's a little bit different. In effect, all of these eventually fall. So the rebellion is extinguished, Tuscany's efforts have to be redirected to Iran, and those eventually peter out. Okay, so then I thought I would sort of bring this to an end by taking some stock of what we've seen. Right? We had a lot of details, thousands of years of history, lots of details about Iran, Syria, and Turkey. Okay, so there's rivalry, right, between an Ottoman Empire whose major power base is in Anatolia and the Balkans, and the Safavid Empire whose major power base is on the Iranian plateau. The Safavids are also working with the Russians to open up trade routes north and to gain control of the Persian Gulf. Right, so Iranian expansion. The Ottoman state is beset by leadership problems, by a change in its military and political organization, such that by the 16 teens it functions very differently than it had in the 1580s, and a flowering of rebels who had been part of the old military political order, often on the kind of margins, who organized themselves. The execution of the head of the Kambulad clan leads to a sort of Kurdish rebellion in cooperation with Lebanese Druze forces in Syria, and they seek Western intervention. And I use Western intervention advisedly here. It's true that the Grand Duchy of Tuscany is the only party that actually arrives with people on the ground, but the goal is to have the entire Catholic naval alliance come. Right? So they're looking for European intervention more generally. And European allies use the rhetoric of tyranny and liberation. They provide advanced weapons and prestige goods and legitimation. Right? They rely on sort of offshore naval intervention and money, but few troops on the ground and sort of half measures. And they end up hosting exiles not just before, but also after. So with the failure of this rebellion, Fakhreddin ends up in Tuscany and spends several years under the Tuscan sun before going back to Lebanon. And ultimately, the Ottoman army, the Turkish army here, which is bruised and battered by rebellion, is nonetheless successful in suppressing all of the rebels. And the Ottoman Empire is in fact not done expanding. That won't happen until 1683. And European powers, for all their rhetoric of Ottoman tyranny and their goals of liberation, immediately resume commercial relations and tell the Tuscans to stop what they've been doing. That's sort of my structural take on this, and I'll be interested to hear your feedback or questions. And then, the this is the sort of source space for it. So I'm all done. Yeah.
The Tuscan was exiled from Aleppo.
Mm-hmm.
Why was he exiled? Was he also Kurdish? Did he identify with the emir in Aleppo in any way?
No. So he's from Aleppo himself. He's Arab, I suppose, in our sort of ethnic definitions here. He gets in trouble for converting in order to marry, a sort of love marriage, and he falls out with a renegade. It's an Ottoman commander who's originally also from Italy. So there's a series. He falls out with the Ottoman commander in Aleppo in the 1580s, and so goes into exile in Iran, and then goes back and forth. So he sort of makes his home, insofar as he has a stable one, in Shah Abbas's Iran, which is not that unusual of a thing for a dragoman to do. They're always on this sort of borderline, and I suppose the language knowledge provides that as a possibility. So there's a lot of historiography on dragomans in Istanbul and in Venice who have similarly sort of problematic loyalties and are distrusted. Yeah.
Thanks. I guess two questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first, and actually if you could respond to the first one, how does this presentation fit into your broader work? Because I mean, in some sense, like I want to ask you a question that hopefully is useful for your work and not like, oh, well, this is how I would do it, because that's always the challenge with like respond from our own position. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more. I mean, it's clear that this fits into a broader project, so, or it seems like it's part of a broader project. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that project, and then I've got a question for you about the way your approach is.
Excellent. So this is part of a broader project in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany and its efforts to participate in global empire and trade. This is a section on the sort of plot to destroy the Ottoman Empire. They are a series of rebel groups in Cyprus and the Balkans, and there's context with the Maronites and with the Druze and with this particular rebel in Aleppo. So Tuscany's interest is in sort of destroying the Ottoman Empire. So this fits in my sort of part 3 of my project, which is on its efforts to try to do that. And in particular, its efforts to play a sort of brokering role between Shah Abbas, who has a major army, and Spain, who has a major army and navy, and to use its forces in a sort of strategic way to bring those two together. I suppose and there are more details to offer on the project there. Tuscany does these sorts of things in Morocco and Algeria and the Balkans, and so this is a part of a broader pattern. And they regularly run themselves into problems, like the ones they run into in Hong Kong, Syria here, which have to do with information and the people they rely on. Right? So they employ lots of exiles with a grievance, and multilingual diplomats, or people who call themselves nobles, who show up in Tuscany with a project of liberation. So Tuscany also plays host, for instance, to Moroccan exiles and is involved in a Moroccan Civil War nearly contemporaneously, and is also using a rhetoric of liberation and of legitimacy against an illegitimate regime in Morocco. That's the sort of and what I've tried to capture here a little bit, and this is a little bit different than my core project, but how I've sort of recast it for this, are some of these structural features and rhetorical features, so like how the Tuscans see this, right? The Ottomans obviously don't see Tuscany as a great threat, just incredibly irritating. And that Tuscans are quite effective at raiding Ottoman shipping, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in particular, relatively important shipping between Egypt and Anatolia, and some sort of capturing high prestige individuals and holding them as slaves and sacking Greek islands and causing. So Tuscany is definitely perceived as being extraordinarily irritating, but no more than that. Right. So Tuscany has dreams of grandeur and of a role that it will destroy the Ottoman Empire, which is out of all proportion to, I think, how either their Syrian allies or the Ottomans actually see them. So we're trying to capture some of that, their own worldview. Your second question?
Well, so the second question I think actually picks up on this idea of how you're using particular terms to kind of map back into the past. And so, like, hearing your presentation, it seems like you're making an argument for thinking about sort of really powerful structural continuities that are also geographical continuities, like the idea of like Iran. But wondering whether, and this gets to the problem of Syria in particular, wondering about spending a little more time developing the physical geography of things and not necessarily referring to Iran and Syria, even though these are like actual existing archival terms that have kind of currency as terms, but thinking particularly this part of the world, there's an alternate way of naming the region that includes Aleppo, Diyarbakir, Mosul, Baghdad, Jazeera. So looking at the islands of this kind of the physical geographic region between the Tigris and Euphrates, and wondering if that's a much more salient geographical category to think about conflict, to think about the political economy of conflict, than Syria in this case.
That's a good question, and it might actually be a better category to analyze, and it would be something to bring in. The reason I use that is that this is the direct translation from the Italian, and in fact from the Syriac originally, right, which is a protector of Aleppo, Damascus, and Tripoli in Syria. Right, so it's an actors category. So I use that. This is also why I fold Lebanon into Syria, although in many ways it doesn't fit that easily, and the experience of the Druze in Mount Lebanon is really very different than the experience that in many ways ties Aleppo all the way to Baghdad and to, right, much more closely so that this sort of tension perhaps, and this is something to think with, which is when I publish on this, etc., I tend to use only actors categories from the period, but it does limit, and I suppose that's part of the premise of this talk, is that does limit our analytical ability to have a conversation across time periods. So I think your idea of using a different geographic, like an analytical geographic term, as well as the geographic term used by the actors themselves, might be really helpful. And in terms of Iran, right, they view themselves as the Safavid Empire, right? Above, and are described as that, right? Westerners almost always view them as Persians, right? Regardless of their actual ethnic identity and even geography to a certain extent, right? It's just Persia, and that's neoclassicizing. Right, so that's that they were the Persians to the Greeks, and so they must forever be the Persians to the Europeans, right? And they said King of Persia will be, which is obviously not how the Safavids see themselves. That's part of how they see themselves, but it's not by any means the whole thing. And then in terms of the ethnic identities, this I'm more uncomfortable with. I rely on the historiography here. I've got this book, The Great Anatolian Rebellion, which is on the Chalalis. It's like Griswold, I want to say. And that the terminology he uses is Kurdish. So I use that there. I got this. It's this one here. Because my research is linguistically confined to the Italian side, so I can't follow the other one. And that's, I suppose, a structural weakness of any sort of global history. Is, I have also these Italians in Japan and China, right? And Russia, and I wish that I could follow the story on the other side, but often we're stuck with the translations into Spanish or Italian or Portuguese.
So the Holy Land then is referring specifically to Judea or Israel or whatever it's called in...
Yeah, they're quite vague about it, actually. They have a notion of Jerusalem and sort of the old kingdom of Jerusalem, and there are people in Europe who still have the title the King of Jerusalem. Right, so this is attached, that they no longer have any sort of close claim to it. And so there are these crusader, like the ghosts of the crusader states, and people who have claims to that. And the Holy Land tends to be identified with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Again, this hasn't existed in any substantive way since, 1291 at last, but really since the 12th century as like a major force, right? And this part of, I suppose, the way that their fantasies, if we might say about this, or their ideological categories are a little different than ours, is that they're inflected, one, by the legacy of the Crusades, and two, by neoclassicizing ideas, right? That they're deeply conscious that Alexander the Great was here, or that Seleucus was here, or that this was a site of Roman conflict, right? So there's that element. Yeah.
I'm curious where the Tuscan leadership got the boldness to go with these endeavors, because North Italy is a pragmatic, risky place for a state. Were there alone in their thoughts? What were the thoughts of their neighboring Italian states? Did they kind of gave them support rhetorically so that they can exhaust themselves? Because this is a very luxurious thing to spend your materials in when you're in a very risky neighborhood.
So this is a sort of moment in time when it's possible for Tuscany. Following the end of the Italian Wars and the conquest of Siena in the 1550s, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany sort of coalesces into a regional state, which is heavily fortified. I guess it's this way. So the Grand Duchy of Tuscany is filled with modern fortifications like this, which would present trouble for even a major field army of any power. Right? So the Tuscany is reasonably technically secure. Its neighbors are the Papal States, who are an ally, Genoa, who is a client of Spain, and Spain. And in particular, Spain controls Milan and the Kingdom of Naples, and a series of possessions known as the Presidial States on the coast of Tuscany. So it is actually surrounded by either direct allies, like the papacy, or territories and clients of the King of Spain. This means that Tuscany's position is really constrained when it wants to go off and set up an East India Company. Spain says no. And when it intervenes in Morocco, where Spain says you are, the Spanish court basically shuts down Tuscan operations in Morocco on the grounds that this is destabilizing something which is too close to Spain. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Spanish are content to allow Tuscany to have its head, basically.
And at that time, French aren't a problem?
No, they're beset by civil war, by 8 civil wars, it turns out. They have just reconsolidated, so in the first decade of the 17th century, they've just reconsolidated royal authority, right? So Paris is where the Mass, 1590s. But France has, it has consuls, it has a fleet, but it is in a relatively weak position. That will change quite dramatically in the 17th century. So by already by the mid-17th century, France will be in some ways the most important player in the sort of region we think of as Syria, and it has a historic alliance with the Ottoman Empire. And Tuscany is shielded a little bit because it's both married into the French royal house, Catherine de' Medici, Marie de' Medici, and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany pays for Henry IV's, so Henry IV's campaigns and stuff. So Tuscany is able to sort of push the envelope. And the person who bails out Karai when he's being tortured by Ottoman forces is a French merchant. And so there is a French merchant community there, but there's no power projection ability in France at that stage. This will change, but really not until the 1630s can they challenge the Spanish or Spanish alliance, by which time Tuscany's out. Tuscany in many ways sees itself like a giant Malta, bellicose and heavily fortified and engaged in a holy war. It also tries at the same time to turn this into a free port, and in fact to offer even our enemies, the Turks, can come and freely trade here. But this, as you can see, is pretty discouraging.
Yeah.
So it turns out to be a major haven for Jewish communities, but not for, it's actually one of the major centers of Jewish exile, but not for Turkish trade. It does some trade with North Africa, but most of this is a matter of reciprocally ransoming captives in Algiers and Tunis. And Tuscany has several thousand slaves, and the Algerians have several thousand slaves. Wouldn't it be nice to swap them? So, yeah.
Well, I know very little of what you were describing, but of course it resonates with what we know now, or what we live with now. And the perseverance of persistence of the communities is striking, and I wonder to what extent that this is just tight cultural entities which are pretty stable. Empires come and go because the empires don't really rule very much. They get tribute and they send their armies around, but most of the people are just doing their regular business. And this is a very, the empires are just floating on top. I don't know if that.
The historiography on the Ottoman Empire in Syria and Lebanon, and in particular in Lebanon, suggests that there's some space for that there are notables, that there's a sort of devolution of power. There's an Ottomanist in Stanford where I was recently who works on these notables. There's a sort of practical devolution of power where the authority from the center is pretty weak, and there's a lot of appointments of people who are already individually important in the region, who become important and then lay down roots. And so I suppose that's with any empire, and so with the Ottomans as well. There's sort of differences in different geographies of the empire as to how deeply the administration bites into the local communities. In places like Mount Lebanon or in mountainous regions of Syria and southeastern Turkey, where the economic interests are very weak and the costs of control are very high, the empire has a pretty light touch, and it's more inclined, or at least the historiography suggests that it's more inclined to mobilize local armed groups to co-opt them into the. This is also the story sort of outside of major urban centers in the Arabian Peninsula. So goes the narrative about this. Tuscany is different this way, in that this is an administration which seeks to entirely sort of reform Tuscany and make Tuscany instead of all of these particularistic. And so it develops this gigantic and very intrusive bureaucracy, which many of you perhaps have been in the building for, because its main building is the Uffizi, which is the Tuscan for offices. And it develops this enormously intrusive bureaucratic state, which is looking to make Tuscans and make them good Catholics and good monarchists. But that's really only possible, and Tuscany has trouble with this as a whole in a really small, intensely governed state.
So they gotta start modernization before head start on
This is the traditional story is that places like Tuscany serve as the model for 17th century French absolutism. And therefore they run into the same kind of problems that 17th century French absolutism runs into in the 18th century, earlier, right? So what happens when you have an incompetent Grand Duke? What happens when you run out of money with all of this pomp, or when you strangle the economy with all of these state-supported entities, or this extensive and autocratic bureaucracy and all of these privileges? And then Tuscany is again a sort of, in the 18th century, is a sort of model principality for enlightened absolutism. So it's a sort of training ground for Habsburg princes. You're going to go and be the Austrian emperor. Well, first you go and rule Tuscany and try things out. And you can often try things out in Tuscany that you can't do back in Austria. So it's this sort of like model, heavily governed place. If any of you spend time in Tuscany, it has not even now been fully successful, for certainly with traffic laws. So that aspiration to intensive governance is maybe not always the best. Yeah.
When you mentioned earlier about Lebanese Jews having a different experience, what were you referring to exactly? Very broadly.
The quest for autonomy is basically more successful. It's more successful in part because they have a coastal position, in part because they have more effective leadership. Red Fakreddin comes back and manages to maintain a level of autonomy, and they're more effective at getting long-term sort of European aid and influence. So that measure of autonomy is it works better for them, in effect, than it does for the Kambalats, who are really done at this stage as a separate entity. Right. This isn't to say that there aren't other notables there, but this specific state set up in Lebanon, you'll see like certain sort of nationalist or like Lebanese pride who will trace it all the way back to Fakhreddin II as like the founding figure and the lineal descent. And nobody really does that to Ali Pasha anymore, or at least I haven't been able to trace that. Yeah.
Why did the I'm not sure if you talked about this at all. Why did Shah Abbas capitalize on his victory and support Ali Pasha instead of going all the way to Tuscany? Instead of having Ali Pasha go all the way to Tuscany for support. I mean, the logical thing would be that the rebels in Iraq and Syria would be backed by Shah Abbas and he would capitalize on his victory, right?
He moves in a different direction. It's an interesting question. Perhaps it's what he should have done. He decides that he should consolidate his position in the Caucasus and take traditional Iranian territory, traditional Safavid territory there. The Tuscans would like him to do that, right? So they send Karai, right, with the notion that we'll provide the heavy artillery you need, right, and some of the other sort of technical support, and we'll all fight as a grand alliance. We'll have a Spanish army and a Syrian rebel army, and we'll have our Lebanese forces and the Shah Abbas, and we'll all fight against this great Ottoman tyranny. They all have, in many ways, though, like that's Tuscany's vision. Shah Abbas's vision is a little bit different than that, right? And same with, they're not necessarily all that eager for, like they're eager for the Ottoman Empire to be weakened, but not necessarily eager that these particular successor states will come to power, or that. So in retrospect, we can say that like it would have been extraordinarily helpful for the Syrian rebels if there had been a Safavid army with them. They might have won. But that's not how they viewed their strategic priorities at the time. And perhaps it's a little bit, the Ottoman reaction is faster than they expect it's going to be. Right? They think this sort of rapid collapse in 1606, right, that the Ottomans will still be stuck in the war in the Balkans, and that they will not be able to react in 1607. So they do catch them a bit by surprise. And the Jalali position in Anatolia falls apart much faster than the rebels in Syria expected it's going to. Yeah.
So at the time you said the Ottomans were also fighting the Habsburgs.
Yeah.
Right? Which was the Spanish monarchy.
They're related to the Spanish monarchy. So Charles V is an Austrian Habsburg by descent, right? But he divides his inheritance. So the Austrian inheritance includes Bohemia and Austria and bits of Hungary and the title of Holy Roman Emperor, which is often derided, but in wars with the Ottomans is actually quite a big deal. They do get pretty substantial support from the empire, and indeed from like allied Italian forces technically in the empire, like Mantua, right? Fight on the front there. So there is a this is the Austrian Habsburg Empire, which will eventually fight with such success in the 30 Years' War, the early 30 Years' War. So that it is, and there are other sort of anti-Ottoman forces in Eastern Europe that they can draw on, in particular in Transylvania.
I was just curious why there wasn't more coordination between Tuscany and them.
Yeah, Tuscany really wants this is their vision, right? They want all the Habsburgs to fight the Ottomans all at once, and that if the Ottomans will fight in sequence, then they're going to win, which is what happens. And they're quite disappointed that the Austrians make peace in 1606. The Austrians desperately need peace, though, because the reality is that the Ottoman Empire is more powerful than any of these individual units, right? So that in a straight conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the Austrians will lose. And in a straight conflict with the Safavids will lose. So they rely on fighting at once. And the failure of this coordination allows the Ottomans to basically retake all their losses in a subsequent war with the Safavids, and then to do it to the Venetians, and then to do it to the Austrians. And that doesn't end until the Siege of Vienna in 1683. And so they have, so that it's, that the Tuscans have the right strategic insight, if that's what you're trying to do, is that like you're not going to win unless we all fight at the same time. But I think the Austrians take it as an opportunity to get a desperately needed peace.
Well, I hate to end this conversation, but unfortunately we are out of time. I want to thank Dr. Brege for coming in today for this truly fascinating discussion.